The pain hit me like a trap door opening under my feet. 1 second, I was standing in the shower, the water running warm down my back, my hand resting on the curve of my stomach the way it always did now, a habit I'd had for months. The next second, something inside me dropped, sharp, sudden, wrong, and my legs simply weren't mine anymore. I slid across the wet tile and the back of my head cracked against the edge of the tub, hard enough that white light bloomed behind my eyes and swallowed the room whole. When the world came back, I was on the floor. The water was still running. Something warm was sliding down the inside of my thigh, mixing with the shower spray, blooming across the white tile in a stain that started pale and then wasn't pale at all. I looked down at it. It wasn't pink. It was red. Deep, unmistakable red. My phone was on the vanity, a few feet away. May as well have been a mile. I dragged myself up on my forearms, my palms sliding on the wet floor, and it took 2 tries before my fingers found the screen. I called Nathaniel first. Of course I did. He was my husband. It rang and rang into nothing. I called again. The number you have dialed is not available at this time. Another wave of cramping doubled me over, my forehead pressing into the cold tile, my whole body curling around the pain like a hand closing into a fist. The bleeding was getting heavier. I could feel it leaving me in warm pulses that turned cold almost instantly against my skin, against the floor, against everything. I called a 3rd time, a 4th, a 5th. Straight to voicemail, every time, his recorded voice cheerful and unbothered, telling me to leave a message. I tried Marisol, our housekeeper. Off. I tried Owen, Nathaniel's assistant. Off. I was 28 weeks pregnant. At my last appointment, the doctor had looked at my chart, then at me, and said the baby was healthy, strong even, but that my own body ran fragile, low iron, a history of fainting, blood pressure that dipped when it shouldn't, and that my family needed to stay close, needed to be reachable. Nathaniel had been on his phone through that entire conversation. He hadn't lifted his head. He'd made a sound in his throat that I'd taken, generously, for agreement. That was 7 months ago and 20 minutes ago, both at once. The baby had been kicking me for weeks by then, little percussive taps against my ribs every morning around 5, so reliable I used to lie there in the dark and wait for it before my alarm went off. I dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" "I'm 28 weeks pregnant. I fell. I'm bleeding. A lot." My own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, flat and very far away. "Okay, ma'am, I need your address." 14 Wyndham Court, Wyndham Estates. "We're dispatching an ambulance now. I do need to let you know there's severe, unusual gridlock downtown tonight because of a large public event. EMS is reporting significant delays. Please stay on the line with me." Delays. How long? 10 minutes? 30? I looked at the pool spreading beneath me on the tile, faster now, and I understood with a strange, distant clarity that I could not simply wait and find out. I hung up on the dispatcher mid-sentence and opened a rideshare app with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. 67 people ahead of you. Estimated wait, 45 minutes. I switched apps. No cars available in your area. I tried a 3rd. Before I could even search for a ride, a banner ad slid across the top of the screen, hot pink, cheerful, obscene in its cheer. "Callaway Holdings, $500, Surge Bonanza. All drivers heading downtown for tonight's Written in the Stars celebration receive an instant premium bonus." I swiped it away without reading past the first line and tried again. "No drivers available in your area." I crawled out of the bathroom on my hands and knees, the tile scraping my skin raw, and hauled myself up using the bedroom door frame. The robe I'd had on was soaked through, the lower half gone a deep, saturated red, like it had been dyed. I grabbed a coat from the closet, wrapped it around myself with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else, and went barefoot to the front door for my car keys. But my hands wouldn't hold still, and dark spots were swimming at the edges of my vision, swelling and receding like something breathing. I couldn't drive. I knew that the way you know your own name. I called Nathaniel again. This time it connected. It wasn't him. Behind whoever had picked up, there was music, laughter, a whole world of sound. A young man's voice, unfamiliar, a little too bright. "Mrs. Calloway? Where's Nathaniel? Where's my husband?" "Mr. Calloway's a little busy right now, ma'am. He can't come to the phone. Is there something I can help you with?" This was Curtis, his driver. I recognized the name from somewhere, though I'd never had a real conversation with him. "I'm bleeding." I heard my own voice say it, toneless, unrecognizable. "I can't get a car. Can you send someone?" "Hold on, Mrs. Calloway. Let me go ask him." The noise on the other end swelled, a woman laughing, someone shouting, "Nate, come look at this!" And then Curtis's voice grew distant, pulled away by whatever had grabbed his attention. The call didn't drop. I just stood there, in my own entryway, holding the phone against my ear, my bare feet going numb on the marble, blood sliding down the inside of my legs and pooling cold around my toes. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. No one came back. I hung up. When I finally stepped outside, the whole street was dark. Wyndham Estates was the kind of exclusive, quiet neighborhood where nobody walked anywhere, and everybody's lights went off by 10. Not a single soul out. I followed the street lamps toward the main road, each step making me feel like something inside me was sinking lower, dropping through my body like a stone through water. By the time I reached the edge of the community, I was drenched in a cold sweat, and under the brighter lights of the main road, I could finally see what I already knew. My coat was soaked through with blood. My bare feet were bruised and filthy against the asphalt, and I was, unmistakably, a woman in serious trouble, standing alone on a dark street at 10 o'clock at night. I raised my hand for a cab. The first one drove past without even slowing. The second didn't stop either. The third slowed, at least. The driver rolled down his window, glanced at me, and I watched a flicker of hesitation cross his face before he spoke. "The nearest hospital, please," I said. "Please." "Sorry, lady, I'm heading downtown, not doing local fares tonight." "What?" "The CEO of Callaway Holdings is doing some insane thing for his girlfriend's birthday, paying out huge bonuses to every driver who shows up downtown and parks with their headlights on. They're building some kind of giant heart shape with the cars. Everybody's headed there. You're not going to find a ride out here tonight." He glanced in his mirror, taking me in properly for the first time, and something in his expression shifted. "You." "I'm having a miscarriage," I said. My knuckles had gone white where I was gripping his window frame. "Please, take me to the hospital." His face changed completely. He looked down at his phone, back at me, seemed to make some private calculation, and then said, "Get in. I'll take side streets. Just don't let anyone see my plate, okay?" I pulled the door open and folded myself into the back seat. The moment I sat, the fabric beneath me went dark with blood. I saw him clock it in the rearview mirror, saw him suck in a breath. "That's a lot of blood," he said. "Is anyone with you? Family? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The city lights smeared past the window in long yellow streaks, and as we got closer to downtown, traffic thickened into a standstill, a river of black town cars all flowing in the same direction, headlights glowing like a single organism. Then the billboards came into view, all of them lit at once, the entire face of a skyscraper glowing. A cascade of pink light poured down over 3 city blocks. A woman's face rotated across the enormous screen, smiling, radiant, luminous with the kind of joy that costs money. Beside her, a little boy of 4 or 5 sat on someone's shoulders. "Happy birthday, Brooke! My life is for you, Nathaniel Calloway." The letters were 3 stories tall. "Jesus," the driver muttered. "The CEO of Callaway Holdings must be worth a fortune. This car buyout alone probably cost him 10, 20 million, plus all these billboards." He shook his head, half in awe. "They say she's been the love of his life since college. His actual wife probably doesn't get treatment like that." I looked down at my hands. They were dark with dried blood, caked into the creases of my knuckles, packed under my fingernails. "We're here. That's Union Memorial up ahead." Before the car had even fully stopped, I was pushing the door open. The moment I stood, my legs simply gave out from under me and my knees hit the pavement. I heard the driver shout something behind me, heard footsteps running toward me from the entrance, and then the world began to soften and blur at the edges, sound fading into a long, underwater hum. The last thing I saw, before everything went dark, was pink. An endless, glowing sea of pink light, lit up above me by a man for a woman who wasn't me. I grew up in a small college town in the Midwest, the only child of 2 professors who taught, respectively, structural engineering and comparative literature, which meant I grew up in a house that valued precision and narrative in roughly equal measure, and never quite managed to teach me how to fully separate the two. My mother used to say I had my father's brain and her stubbornness, which she meant as a compliment, and which I've come to understand in the years since, was probably an entirely accurate diagnosis of everything that happened to me afterward. I studied applied mathematics as an undergraduate and went straight into a doctoral program afterward, drawn less to the pure theory of it than to the places where numbers met real, breathing consequences. Risk modeling, specifically, the strange, almost occult discipline of trying to quantify exactly how badly the world could go wrong and what it might cost you when it did. I was 2 years into a PhD, publishing modestly, entirely unglamorous, entirely happy in the particular way that focused, difficult work makes a certain kind of person happy. When I met Nathaniel at that gala I mentioned, on a night I'd nearly skipped in favor of finishing a paper. I want to say clearly that I didn't marry him for his money, whatever the tabloids assumed later in the ugly early days before the story fully turned in my favor. I had my own modest but very real path, a dissertation half finished, a small fellowship, the beginnings of a career I was proud of, on a scale that had nothing to do with anyone's fortune but my own effort. I set that path aside for him, the way a lot of women of my generation still quietly set things aside, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself I'd go back to it eventually, once things settled, once the wedding was behind us, once the first year of marriage stopped requiring quite so much of my constant, careful attention. It's a strange thing, watching yourself make that particular bargain in real time and not quite having the vocabulary yet to name what you're doing. I don't blame the 28-year-old version of myself for making it. I understand her completely. She loved a man who was, in the early days, genuinely wonderful to be around, and she believed, the way you believe things when you're young enough to still believe them, that love like that simply continues, that it doesn't require tending the way everything else in life clearly does. The dissertation never got finished. I told myself, for the first 2 years, that I'd get back to it. By the 3rd year, I'd stopped telling myself that, though I never quite admitted the reason out loud, not even to myself in the privacy of my own head. When Callaway Holdings faced that first attack, and I found myself, almost by accident, using exactly the modeling skills I'd built that half-finished dissertation around, it felt less like starting something new, and more like a door I'd assumed was permanently shut, swinging open again, unexpectedly, in a room I'd stopped visiting. The friend who eventually handed me Renee's card, Priya, from my old graduate cohort, one of the only people from my life before Nathaniel I'd managed to keep any real closeness with, had watched the marriage from the outside for years with the particular, quiet worry of someone who loves you but has learned not to say so directly. Because saying so directly tends to make people you love defensive rather than reflective. She gave me the card over lunch, 3 months before that October night, not as an accusation, just as a small practical kindness, the way you'd hand someone an umbrella on the day the sky looks a little uncertain, even if it isn't raining yet. Just in case, she'd said, and I'd laughed, genuinely, and told her I'd never need it. Because at that point, I was 7 months from the end of a marriage I still believed, in some stubborn, unexamined corner of myself, was fundamentally salvageable. I kept the card in my wallet anyway. I think some part of me, even then, already knew. I should tell you how it started, because none of what came later makes sense without it. I met Nathaniel Callaway at a charity gala the winter I turned 26, back when he was still just the reluctant heir to his father's holding company, rather than the man running it into a ditch and then, later, out of one. I was there with a friend from graduate school, wearing a dress I'd borrowed because I couldn't justify buying one. And he was there because his father had insisted, standing near the bar in a tuxedo that fit him like it had been poured on, looking like a man enduring something rather than attending it. He found me later, by the dessert table, and made a joke about the shrimp that wasn't actually funny. And I laughed anyway because he had a particular kind of attention when he looked at you. Total, focused, like you were the only interesting thing in the room. I didn't know yet that this was simply how he looked at anything new. I found that out much later, the hard way, the way you find out most important things about the people you love. He called the next day. He called the day after that. For about 8 months, Nathaniel Callaway was the most attentive man I had ever known. Flowers that showed up at my office with no occasion attached. 3-hour dinners where he actually listened. Long drives with no destination just because I'd once mentioned I liked looking at water at night. I remember thinking, more than once, that I'd gotten unreasonably lucky. My mother used to say, some men are extraordinary at beginnings and terrible at middles. And I used to think that was just something bitter women said to feel better about their own disappointments. I know better now. We married 18 months after we met, in a ceremony that made the society pages, in a dress that cost more than my father's car. I remember standing at the altar looking at him and feeling, underneath all the noise and the flowers and the 400 guests, something that felt very much like safety. I want to be honest and say that feeling was real, even if it turned out to be built on sand. I wasn't a fool, whatever else I was. I loved him. That's simply a true thing that happened, and I don't think pretending otherwise now does either of us any favors. The trouble, if I can locate its beginning at all, started about a year in, right around the time his father died and Nathaniel inherited the company 2 decades earlier than anyone expected him to. He changed the way people change under sudden, enormous pressure. Not all at once, but by degrees so small that you don't notice the sum of them until you're already living inside a different marriage than the one you started. He worked later. He stopped asking how my day went and started simply assuming it had gone fine, the way you assume a chair will hold your weight without checking. He looked at his phone during dinner, then during breakfast, then, eventually, during almost everything. I threw myself into something of my own around that same time, half out of loneliness and half out of a kind of stubborn refusal to just sit in an enormous house and wait for a man to come home. I had a background in applied mathematics I'd never fully used, a graduate degree I'd set aside when we got married, the way women in my position were still quietly expected to. When Callaway Holdings got hit by that first short-selling attack, 4 months after Nathaniel took over, I watched him come home, gray-faced and half a decade older than he'd been that morning. And something in me, some old, unused muscle, simply woke up. I didn't tell him what I was doing. I'm not entirely sure, even now, why not. Part of it was practical. The offshore structure I needed to build to counter-trade anonymously wasn't something you explained casually over dinner. But if I'm being fully honest with myself, part of it was something smaller and more painful than that. I wanted, at least once, for something in that marriage to be entirely mine, something he hadn't paid for, hadn't arranged, hadn't assigned an assistant to manage on my behalf. I built those first hedging programs at my kitchen table over 11 consecutive nights, teaching myself the parts I didn't already know. And when the attack broke and his positions came out clean, I watched him accept everyone else's congratulations and say nothing. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine over those 4 years that probably weren't. Brooke Sinclair, I should say, was never a secret exactly. Nathaniel's college relationship, the one that ended badly right before he met me, I knew her name from the very beginning, knew the outline of their history the way you know the outline of any ex you've never had reason to think much about. She reappeared in his life about 2 years into our marriage, freshly divorced with a young son. And Nathaniel described their renewed friendship to me in language so careful and so deliberately unremarkable that I understood, on some level I didn't let myself examine too closely, exactly what it actually was. I want to say I confronted him properly at some point, with real anger, the kind that clears the air. I didn't. I asked one time, early on, if everything was all right between them, and he looked at me with something close to genuine confusion and said, "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" And I let it go, because the alternative was a fight I didn't yet have the strength to survive. I kept building programs at night instead. I kept counting his footsteps on the stairs, kept learning his schedule down to the hour, kept making myself smaller and quieter and more self-sufficient in every way that didn't require anything at all from him. By the time I got pregnant, 3.5 years into the marriage, I think some small, stubborn part of me believed a child might fix what I already understood, somewhere underneath the parts of myself I wasn't yet ready to admit to, could probably not be fixed. I've read enough since then to know how common that particular delusion is. I don't feel especially foolish about it anymore. I think most people who've loved the wrong person patiently for years have believed some version of the same thing at some point. He was, in fairness, genuinely pleased about the pregnancy, at least at first. He bought too many baby books. He came to 2 appointments out of the first 6. By the 3rd trimester, the calls to Brooke had picked back up in frequency. I knew because I still, out of some old habit I couldn't seem to break, kept half an eye on the corporate phone bill. And the appointments stopped altogether, and I stopped mentioning the growing list of small kicks and hiccups and midnight cravings, because I'd learned, by then, exactly what kind of response I'd get. I'm not telling you all this to make him into a cartoon. He wasn't a cartoon. He was a specific, complicated, deeply distracted man who inherited an enormous amount of pressure very young and handled almost none of it well, and who loved two women badly instead of loving one woman properly, and who never once, across 4 years, thought to ask the quiet person doing his laundry and his taxes and, unbeknownst to him, defending his entire company from the shadows, what she might need. I'm telling you all this because I think it matters. When you get to the part where I leave him bleeding on a bathroom floor, in every sense of that phrase, that you understand it wasn't really about one bad night. One bad night is survivable. 4 years of small, accumulating absences is not. Not once the bill finally comes due all at once, the way bills like that always eventually do. When I woke, I saw a white ceiling and smelled antiseptic. An IV line ran into the back of my left hand. My right hand went, on its own, to my belly and found it flat, soft, collapsed, empty. There was nothing there. I left my hand pressed against my own stomach, my fingers slowly curling into a fist, as if I could grasp something that no longer existed simply by wanting it badly enough. A nurse was at my bedside. "Ms. Winters, Mrs. Calloway, you're awake. How are you feeling?" "The baby." She paused. Her eyes flicked toward the door and back to me. "The doctor will be in to speak with you shortly. Please don't move." "The baby's gone," I said. It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be. She didn't answer, but her eyes filled, and that was answer enough. "You were hemorrhaging when you arrived," she said carefully. "It was a placental abruption. We couldn't save the baby. The doctors performed an emergency procedure and managed to save your uterus." She paused again. "We tried your emergency contacts several times. No one answered. You signed the surgical consent form yourself. Do you remember that?" I didn't remember it. I only remembered the pink light. "Should I try to reach your family again?" she asked. "No." She gave me a long, uncertain look, and then she left. I was alone. The curtains hadn't been fully drawn, and outside the window the sky was just beginning to lighten toward gray. I turned my head toward the nightstand. Someone had set my phone there, the screen cracked in one corner, probably from the fall. I picked it up. 27 missed calls, all from 911 dispatch and the hospital switchboard. From Nathaniel, 0. I opened a news app out of some numb, self-destructive instinct I didn't examine too closely. The top headline read, "Callaway Holdings CEO charters every cab in the city for girlfriend's birthday. The most romantic night the city has ever seen." I clicked the video. In the plaza downtown, hundreds of black town cars had been arranged into the shape of a heart, their headlights the outline, pink floodlights washing the whole street in color. Brooke stood at the center of the crowd laughing, her son perched on someone's shoulders. That someone was Nathaniel. He was smiling, an easy, unguarded smile I hadn't seen aimed at me in longer than I wanted to think about. One hand braced securely around the boy's ankle, the other resting on Brooke's waist. Comments scrolled beneath the clip in an endless, cheerful river. "Oh my God, this is what real love looks like. Rich people's love is just different. I'm crying! Someone marry me like this!" I watched it once. My thumb swiped, almost involuntarily, and the next clip autoplayed. A behind-the-scenes reel from some lifestyle blogger. Sources say Mr. Calloway spent over $20 million tonight booking out the entire city's car service network and outdoor advertising space, all to surprise his college sweetheart. Witnesses confirmed the two held hands throughout the evening, and Mr. Calloway was seen kissing Brooke's forehead in front of the crowd. $20 million. I hadn't been able to get a car last night because every driver in the city was busy building a heart for his one true love. I had walked barefoot down cold asphalt, blood running down my legs, because there wasn't a single ride to be had. My son was gone because there wasn't a single ride to be had. I set the phone face down on the nightstand, and then I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not even a particularly sad one. I laughed the way you laugh when something you've suspected for a long time, something you've refused to look at directly, finally resolves itself into a shape you can no longer pretend not to see. The incision across my abdomen ached with the movement, the stitches pulling. But that pain was nothing next to the other thing. The thing underneath it that didn't even have a name I was willing to give it yet. The phone rang. Nathaniel's name on the screen. I watched it buzz through 6 rings and go silent. 3 seconds later, it started again. I picked up. Clara, Vivian, he caught himself. Vivian, the hospital called, said you were admitted. What happened? Is it serious? I'll have Curtis come get you. Don't bother. A 2-second silence. What's going on? Why didn't you call me if something was wrong? I stared up at the ceiling. White, clean, empty. I did. I didn't see it. My phone was in the car last night. I know where you were, I said, and cut him off. He stopped talking. I waited 5 full seconds. He didn't fill the silence. Nathaniel. Yes? The baby's gone. The line went completely silent. I could hear his breathing change, go rough and uneven, and after what felt like 10 full minutes but was probably closer to 10 seconds, he spoke again. What do you mean? What? You had a miscarriage. Wasn't a sentence I said to him. I said it to myself, quietly, testing the words. Placental abruption, severe hemorrhaging. I signed the surgical consent form myself because no one else was available to sign it. I'm coming right now. Don't, I said. You're busy. By the way, the party looked like a huge success. Top trending story this morning. Congratulations. What are you talking about? That was a corporate event. It's not what you... I'm not thinking anything, I said, and hung up. Then I pulled the IV needle out of my own hand and walked to the nurse's station. Ms. Winters, you can't just leave. Your wound. What's the paperwork for discharge? You can't be discharged yet. You lost nearly a liter of blood last night. You need to be under observation for at least 48 hours. Get the paperwork, I said. The nurse looked at my face and stopped arguing. Whatever she saw there was enough. She turned without another word and came back with a form. Discharge against medical advice. Patient assumes all liability. I signed it. Back in the room, there was nothing to pack. I'd arrived with nothing but blood and a coat. My phone lit up again. Not Nathaniel this time, but a text. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't go anywhere. We need to talk. I read it once, then ejected the SIM card from my phone with a paperclip I found in the nurse's station junk drawer. A nurse lent me a pair of slippers 2 sizes too big. I signed the last of the paperwork and walked out of the hospital into a morning that was fully bright now. The kind of clean, indifferent October sunlight that doesn't care what happened to you the night before. The plaza cars were gone by the time I passed through downtown, but the ground still told the story. Shredded pink balloon fragments, flyers with Brooke's smiling face, LED strips shaped into the word love, sanitation crews sweeping it all into bags. I walked over the debris. The borrowed slippers were too big, and the incision across my stomach pulled with every step. And with every pull, I felt something draining out of me that had nothing to do with blood. Something harder to name than blood. There was a payphone on the corner, one of the last few left in the city, the kind you forget exist until you need one. I stopped, opened my wallet, and found a business card, old and soft at the corners from being carried too long. A friend from law school had pressed it into my hand 3 months earlier, half joking, just in case, and I'd laughed and told her I'd never need it. I dialed the number. It connected. Foss Law, this is Renee Foss. Renee, it's Vivian Winters. Ms. Winters, how can I help you? I want a divorce. A brief pause on the line, then evenly. All right. Can you come to my office to discuss the details? I'm on my way. Foss Law occupied the 7th floor of an unassuming building downtown. No receptionist, no waiting room with soft magazines, just a hallway and a glass door with Renee's name stenciled on it in plain black letters. When I pushed it open, she was standing at the window on a call. She saw me and went still for a full second, her gaze traveling from my face, which must have been the color of old paper, down to the borrowed slippers on my feet, and then to the faint, dark stain visible at the hem of my coat. She ended her call without excusing herself to whoever was on the other end. Sit down, she said. I sat. You said you don't want any of the marital assets. She opened her laptop, forgoing any of the usual preamble. The publicly reported value of Callaway Holdings is somewhere around $5 billion. What's actually in your name? About $2 million in a joint account. Everything else is his. The house is his. The cars are his. So effectively, you'd be walking away with, I have my own money, I said. She looked up at me. I didn't elaborate, and after a moment, she nodded and let it go. The way good lawyers learn to let things go until they need them. Okay, so your requests are divorce, full waiver of community property, and personal freedom secured as fast as possible. Yes. And his position on this? He doesn't know yet. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Are you certain you don't want to negotiate? Even 1% of a $5 billion estate is... I don't need it. She studied me for a few seconds, then closed the laptop entirely and took off her glasses. Ms. Winters, I've been doing this for 12 years. I've watched a lot of people make enormous decisions in the worst hour of their lives and regret them later. In your current state, Renee, I cut her off, gently, the way you'd interrupt someone who is about to walk into traffic out of kindness rather than malice. I'm not being emotional. I'm being clear-headed. I handed her my phone, the screenshot of the headline still open. She read it, and I watched her mouth flatten into a hard, thin line. This was last night, I said, while he was throwing a $20 million birthday party for another woman. I was having a miscarriage. I couldn't get a car to the hospital because he'd chartered the entire city's fleet. I paused. My baby is gone. She handed the phone back without a word and reopened her laptop. I can have a draft ready today. Do you have any residency status overseas? Greek permanent residency. I got it 3 years ago. Something crossed her face. Surprise, quickly suppressed. Is your passport accessible? It's in the safe at the house. Then you'll need to go back for it. Today, while he's occupied. He has board meetings Tuesday afternoons, 3 to 6. Her typing paused for a fraction of a second. She didn't say anything, but I understood exactly what she was thinking. A wife treated the way I'd just described, who could still recite her husband's schedule to the hour without hesitation. It wasn't love. It was habit. The particular habit of carving another person's timetable so deeply into your own life that you arrange your breathing around it without ever quite deciding to. Today was going to be the last day I did that. "I'll email you the agreement," Renee said. "Review it, and if it's acceptable, sign it, photograph every page, and send them back to me. I'll start filing a notarization on my end. When are you planning to leave the country?" "Tomorrow. The day after at the latest." She closed her laptop and put her glasses back on, studying me for a long moment. "Ms. Winters, you know your physical condition better than I do." "I know," I said, and she didn't push further. I stood to go, then stopped in the doorway. "One more thing." "Yes?" "The core architecture of Callaway Holdings' overseas risk management system runs on a proprietary set of programs I designed and patented before we were married. I permitted the company to use them, but I retain root-level access. Once I'm gone, I'm going to revoke that license and put the entire system into dormancy." Renee looked up slowly. "What exactly are you telling me?" "Nothing," I said. "Just that without my keys, their multi-billion-dollar shield is a pane of glass. If anyone from his side reaches out to you asking about my work, you don't know anything about it." I turned to leave. "Miss Winters." I looked back. Renee's expression hadn't changed, but her voice had dropped a degree, gone softer at the edges. "Take care of yourself." I nodded and pulled the door shut behind me. By 4:15 that afternoon, I was back at Wyndham Court. The lock read my fingerprint and let me in without a sound. The house was empty. Marisol's shoes weren't in their usual spot by the mudroom door, which meant Nathaniel had likely called her away to help with something related to last night's event. I didn't want to know what. I went up to the master suite. In the walk-in closet, my clothes hung along 3 racks on the left. His hung on the right. A strip of open space ran between them like a line neither of us had ever quite crossed in 4 years of marriage. I didn't take a single piece of clothing. I opened the second drawer of the nightstand and lifted out a dark blue folder. Inside it, my Greek residency card, my passport, an offshore account card from a private bank in Zurich, and a small encrypted drive. That drive held the master keys to the entire risk architecture of Callaway Holdings. 4 years earlier, when Nathaniel first took over the family company, he'd walked directly into a hostile overseas short-selling attack with no idea what was happening to him. It was me, working alone, at night, using programs I built myself, who stopped the bleeding within 48 hours. And the second time, and the third. Every time, he assumed it was luck, or the new risk team he'd hired being unusually sharp. He never once asked me a single question about it. I tucked the folder into a small tote bag. I stood in the center of the closet for a moment and looked at my 3 racks of clothes, most of them chosen not by me but by Owen, Nathaniel's assistant, who did a seasonal bulk order every year, mostly for Nathaniel, and then, almost as an afterthought, for me. Conservative cuts, muted colors, all of it his taste, filtered through someone else's shopping cart. I didn't take a single piece. Downstairs, on the coffee table, sat a framed wedding photo, me in white, him in black, standing half a step apart, our shoulders not quite touching even in the photograph chosen to represent the happiest day of our marriage. I turned the frame face down. Walking out the front door, my hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but because the incision across my stomach had started seeping again. The doctor had said 48 hours minimum. It had been 18. I crouched by the door for a moment, waiting for the dizziness to pass, then straightened and hailed a car. This time, one arrived instantly. The party was over. The city's fleet had come back to life. At 7 that evening, I checked into a business hotel near the airport. The room was small and the mattress was hard, and when I drew the curtains, no light came through at all, which was exactly what I wanted. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my email. Renee's message was already there, an 8-page divorce agreement attached. I read every word twice. The essential terms came down to 3. Both parties voluntarily agree to dissolve the marriage. The wife waives all rights to the division of marital property and will seek no financial compensation of any kind. The wife is granted full and unrestricted personal freedom, and the husband may not, in any way, restrict her movement, her communications, or her right to leave the country. Renee had added that 3rd clause on her own, without my asking. I noticed, and I was grateful in a way I didn't have the energy to express. I printed 2 copies at the hotel's business center, signed and dated both, and photographed every page. 16 photos in all, checking each one to make sure the signature and the date came through clearly. I sent them to Renee. Signed, flight to Athens tomorrow, 10 a.m. She replied within a minute. Received. Offshore notarization will be complete tonight. Let me know when you're settled. I put the phone down on the nightstand and bent forward, elbows braced on my knees. Something in my chest was cracking open, slow and quiet, nothing like the wound across my stomach. That one was a simple physical thing, something that could be closed with sutures and time. This was different. It had no location, no shape you could point to, but it was breaking all the same. My hands closed around fistfuls of the bedsheet, knuckles white. Don't cry. There's nothing to cry about. 28 weeks, 7 months. He used to kick me every single morning, right around 5, so regular I could have set a clock by it. I'd told Nathaniel about it once, early on, delighted, wanting to share it with him the way you want to share every small miracle with the person you married. He'd been looking at his phone. He made a small sound in his throat and never looked up. After that, I stopped telling him. I loosened my grip. 2 damp patches had appeared on the sheet, not tears, just sweat from my palms. I got up, went into the bathroom, and washed my face. The woman in the mirror was ashen, her lips colorless, dark half-moons under her eyes. But her eyes were dry. Back on the bed, I organized the signed agreement and slid it into the folder beside my passport. The phone lit up again. Not Renee, Nathaniel. 23 messages, all on the same thread. I scrolled through them without responding. Where are you? The hospital said you checked out. Did you go home? I'm sending Curtis to get you. Vivian, stop this. Whatever it is, come back and let's talk about it. I'm sorry about the baby. I really didn't know you were in trouble. I'm heading home now. Wait for me. No one's home. Where the hell did you go? You're not answering. Vivian, can you please not be like this? Let's just talk. The last one had come in 3 minutes earlier. I read all of it and answered none of it. I switched the phone to silent and slid it under the pillow. When I lay down, my abdomen throbbed with a slow, insistent ache, and I curled onto my side, one palm resting against the flat, empty place where a whole other person used to be. Nothing was there anymore. I closed my eyes. My flight was in 9 hours. The alarm went off at 6. I'd already been awake, hadn't really slept at all if I was honest. The pain in my stomach waking me every hour or two through the night, the phone under the pillow buzzing steadily against the mattress. I didn't check it. I got up, washed my face, and went through the contents of my bag one more time. Passport, residency card, offshore account card, the encrypted drive, a black hoodie, and a pair of sweatpants I'd bought from the hotel's small convenience shop the evening before. It was enough. I checked out and took a cab to the airport. In the car, I opened my phone one last time. Nathaniel's messages had climbed past 60. The tone of the last handful had shifted, gone sharper, more frightened underneath the anger. Vivian, if you don't answer me, I'm calling the police. Are you doing this to spite me? I can explain what happened last night. The Brooke thing was a company PR event arranged by marketing. It's not what you think. Calm down. I'm genuinely worried about you. I'm devastated about the baby too. Don't go through this alone. Come back and we'll face it together. Please. I read the last one, exited the thread, opened my contacts, found his name, and deleted it. Then I opened the remote access portal for Callaway Holdings' internal systems, entered my credentials, and navigated to the core risk management panel. The screen showed the status of 6 hedging programs, every indicator glowing green. I had written each of them, one at a time, over the past 4 years, each tied to a specific piece of the company's overseas exposure. Without them, $3 billion in international positions would be sitting completely unprotected. I clicked Deactivate All. A confirmation box appeared. Are you sure you want to place all core hedging programs into dormant status? Reactivation will require biometric verification from the original key holder. Confirm. The 6 green lights turned gray. I closed the page. Then I did one last thing. I popped the SIM card out of my phone, a tiny sliver of plastic, small enough to disappear between 2 fingers. I'd carried that number for 4 years. I'd gotten it after the wedding, on his corporate plan. His assistant had it. His driver had it. His housekeeper had it. Everyone who mattered to his world had that number. I held it for a second between my fingers as the cab pulled up to departures. The morning air outside was cold, late October cold, sharp enough to sting. Somewhere behind me, sanitation crews were probably still finding pink balloon fragments in gutters. I dropped the SIM card into a trash can by the terminal doors. It was so light, it made no sound at all when it landed. Inside, at gate B7, waiting for the flight to Athens by way of a connection, a 14-hour journey in total, I took a window seat and watched the other passengers file past. Business travelers, families, a group of college kids headed somewhere sunny for a long weekend. None of them could have guessed that the woman at gate B7 had lost her 7-month-old son 18 hours earlier. My phone, useless as a phone now, could still find the airport's Wi-Fi. I opened my email and sent Renee one last message before boarding. At the gate, final confirmation before takeoff. Once the agreement is signed on the other end, I don't want to be involved in any follow-up. All communication goes through you. He does not get my new contact information. She replied almost immediately. Understood. I'll handle everything. Be safe. I closed my email and opened a browser instead, some part of me needing to see it one more time before I put an ocean between myself and it. The story was still trending, past 100 million views by then, the comments a solid wall of "so romantic" and "true love" and "Mr. Callaway is so devoted." I looked at it for 2 seconds and closed the tab. The final boarding call came. I got in line and handed my passport to the gate agent. She scanned it, glanced up, and smiled. "Have a pleasant flight." The jet bridge was long and lit with a cold, sterile white light. Every step carried me farther from the city, from the empty house on Wyndham Court, from a man who'd never once come home when he said he would, from a man who'd lit up an entire skyline for a woman who wasn't his wife. At the aircraft door, I paused, not from hesitation, but because a sharp pain shot through my abdomen without warning, and I had to lean into the wall for a few seconds to steady myself. A flight attendant appeared at my elbow. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine." I found my seat and fastened the belt. Outside the window, the runway sat gray under an overcast sky, and in the distance, a plane was already lifting off, tilting through the low clouds and vanishing in seconds. I was about to disappear the same way, from Nathaniel Calloway's world, from this city, from every person who thought they knew who I was. The plane began to taxi. I rested my forehead against the cold glass. Goodbye. The moment of takeoff pressed me back into the seat. I closed my eyes. My hand went, out of pure habit, to my abdomen and froze there against the emptiness. I pulled it back and set it flat on the armrest instead. That instinct, the reaching, the checking, would have to unlearn itself eventually. It hadn't started yet. 30 minutes into the flight, somewhere above 30,000 feet, I understood that on the ground, Nathaniel had probably just found the open safe. He would be tearing the house apart looking for some explanation, some clue. He would call my number and hear the recording. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He'd panic, but not real fear yet, not yet. He would assume I was punishing him, throwing some extended, dramatic tantrum meant to bring him to heel. He would assume that in a few days, a week at most, I would come home the way I always had before. Because in his mind, I didn't have anywhere else to go. No money of my own, no connections, no way out. He was about to learn how wrong he was. But that now was his problem, not mine. I pulled the window shade down, wrapped myself in the thin airline blanket, and closed my eyes. In 14 hours, I would land on another continent, by another sea, under a different kind of sunlight entirely. A sunlight without Nathaniel Calloway in it, anywhere. I landed in Athens on a bright, ordinary afternoon, the kind of light that makes a new place look like a postcard of itself before you've had time to learn its actual texture. My connection had been long enough that by the time I cleared customs, I'd slept maybe 4 hours total across the whole journey, most of it fitful, my body still catching up with everything it had been through in the days before. I'd arranged, weeks earlier, back when I still believed, some stubborn residual part of me, that I might never actually need to use any of it. A small apartment through a property manager who handled residency holder rentals, someone I'd found through the same discreet channels I'd used to build my Greek status in the first place. I gave the taxi driver the address in slow, careful Greek, the extent of which I'd taught myself over 3 years of quiet evenings, another thing Nathaniel had never known about, and watched the city slide past the window. Nothing like the glass and steel I'd left behind. Everything older, denser, built on a scale that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. The apartment was small and plain, a single bedroom above a shuttered shop in a quiet neighborhood, chosen specifically because it wasn't anywhere a person would think to look for the wife of an American CEO. I remember standing in the doorway of it for a long moment before I could make myself walk inside, exhausted in a way that went well past the physical, the incision across my stomach throbbing steadily under my hoodie, my whole body still operating on some kind of survival autopilot that hadn't yet gotten the message it was allowed to stop. I slept for 11 hours that first night, longer than I'd slept in one stretch in longer than I could remember, and woke disoriented, momentarily unsure what country I was in, my hand moving instinctively to my stomach before the rest of my brain caught up with what my hand already knew. The first week is mostly a blur to me now, looking back. I remember finding a doctor recommended by the property manager, a quiet, competent woman who checked the healing incision, adjusted my pain medication, and asked, gently, in accented but careful English, whether I had anyone with me. I told her I didn't, and she didn't push further. Just gave me a card with her direct line and told me to call if anything felt wrong, day or night. I remember the particular relief of a doctor who didn't already know my name from a newspaper. I remember walking to a small market 3 blocks from the apartment on the 3rd or 4th day, moving slowly, one hand pressed lightly against my side, and standing in front of a shelf of tea for what felt like 10 full minutes because I genuinely couldn't make myself care which brand I bought. And then buying 3 different ones because deciding felt impossible and not deciding felt worse. I remember the first time I made myself eat a full meal rather than picking at something out of obligation, sitting alone at a tiny table by a window, watching strangers move through a street where not one single person knew my name, my history, or anything at all about the life I'd just walked out of, and feeling something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere in the narrow space between the two, waiting to be named. I didn't go looking for the Santorini villa until nearly 6 weeks later, once I'd healed enough to travel comfortably and once the divorce paperwork Renee was managing had reached a point where it no longer required my constant attention. I took the ferry out on a gray morning, sat on the upper deck wrapped in a blanket I'd bought for exactly this purpose, and watched the mainland shrink behind me into a pale smudge on the horizon. I found the villa on the 3rd day of looking, through a rental agent who showed me 4 properties before this one, and I knew within about 30 seconds of stepping onto that terrace, looking out at the caldera falling away toward the water, that I wasn't going to look at anything else. There's a particular, specific feeling. I didn't have a name for it before that trip, and I'm not sure I have a perfect one for it now, that comes from standing somewhere for the first time and understanding, on some level below language, that you are looking at the place you're finally going to be allowed to rest. I signed the lease that same afternoon. I moved in 3 days later, with the same small collection of belongings I'd left the country with, plus a handful of new things I'd bought along the way. Books, a few plain practical clothes and colors I'd chosen myself, for the first time in years. A set of dishes I picked purely because I liked the color of the glaze, and not because anyone else had a preference about it. I want to tell you that the grief simply stopped there, on that terrace, the moment the view resolved itself into something worth staying for. It didn't, of course. Grief doesn't respect good real estate. But something did begin there. Some slow, patient process of rebuilding that had nothing to do with revenge and nothing to do with Nathaniel at all. A process that was entirely, finally, only about me. About relearning what my own days could look like when they belonged to no one but the person living them. It was into the middle of that slow, private rebuilding that the rest of the story I'm about to tell you kept arriving, in pieces, from 3,000 miles away. Renee's updates, the headlines Elena would sometimes mention without knowing their significance to me, and eventually, months later, the whole rest of it, delivered in person by a dying man standing at the end of my alley in a coat that didn't belong anywhere near that much sun. I want you to hold both of those things at once as I tell you the rest of it. That I was, during all of it, 3,000 miles away, slowly and deliberately building a life that had nothing to do with any of the wreckage I'd left behind, even while that wreckage kept stubbornly finding ways to reach me anyway. I want to be honest about something before I go further with this. I wasn't there for most of what happened next. I was on a beach on the other side of the world, learning how to fall asleep without listening for a phone that might ring. But over the following months, in fragments, A phone call from Renee here, a headline I stumbled across there, and eventually, much later, a confession delivered to me in person by a dying man on my own doorstep. I put together the rest of the story. I've told it to myself so many times since then that it plays now like something I witnessed directly, even though I didn't. So forgive me if it reads that way. This is what I know happened, as close as I can get to the truth of it. Nathaniel dialed my number for the 31st time the day I disappeared. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. He stood in our bedroom doorway, holding the phone, staring into the open walk-in closet. My 3 racks of clothes were still hanging there, untouched, not a single piece missing, because I hadn't wanted any of it. But the second drawer of the nightstand stood open and empty, and my passport was gone. He called Owen.
Find out if Vivian has any international travel booked for today.
Mr. Calloway, what do you...
Now!
3 minutes later, Owen called back. Sir, Miss Winters departed from the airport this morning at 7:48. Destination? Athens. Nathaniel's knuckles went white around the phone. Book me a flight to Athens tonight. Sir, you have the creditor briefing at... Cancel everything. He hung up. He stood alone in the bedroom, and for the first time in a long while, maybe the first time ever, he noticed how quiet the house was. It had always been quiet in a way. I'd never been loud, never played music, never turned the television up. I took up very little space in that house, on purpose, over years, without ever quite deciding to. But this quiet was different. This was an empty quiet, and there's a difference you only learn to feel once it's happened to you. He walked into the closet and touched the sleeve of a gray cashmere coat Owen had bought for me the year before.
He couldn't remember how many times I'd worn it.
He realized, standing there, that he couldn't picture my face clearly, not fully. He remembered the general shape of my features the way you remember a stranger's, but he couldn't remember what I looked like when I smiled, or when the last time was that I had. His phone rang. Brooke. He looked at the screen and didn't answer. It rang for 8 seconds and stopped. A text came through instead. Nate, thank you so much for last night. Milo won't stop talking about the cars. Let's do it again soon. He set the phone face down on the nightstand, sat on the edge of the bed with his hands clasped and his head bowed, and outside, the sky stayed a deep, indifferent October blue. He assumed I'd be back within a week. He was wrong about that, but it would take him longer than he expected to understand exactly how wrong. A week later, Owen dialed my old number for the 17th time. Same message, same dead end. He hung up, stood outside Nathaniel's office door for a long moment, and finally knocked. Sir, Miss Winters' number is still disconnected. Immigration confirms she landed in Athens, but we can't locate her beyond that. We don't have the access to search Greek civil records. Nathaniel sat behind his desk, spinning a pen between 2 fingers. Contact her father's people. We did, sir. Her family's household staff said, and I'm quoting them directly, "Our daughter's movements do not need to be reported to Mr. Calloway." He set the pen down, fingertips tapping the desk in a slow, agitated rhythm. Fine. Let her have her space. She'll come around when she's cooled off. A breath. Is the afternoon meeting ready? It is, sir, but there's something else you should know. Risk management flagged an issue this morning. All 6 core hedging programs in the overseas risk system have gone into dormant mode. Key verification failed. They're saying they need the original key holder to reactivate them, and that information is encrypted. They can't identify who that is. Nathaniel looked up. What does that mean? A system failure? Not a failure. A manual operation. Someone deliberately put every program into dormancy a week ago. The director of risk says he didn't even know these 6 programs existed. They're written at the base code level, buried deep in the architecture. He frowned, but only for a second. Have the tech team crack it. They tried. The keys are double encrypted. Without biometric verification from the original holder, they say it's not possible. Then hire an outside team, immediately. Owen hesitated. Sir, about the key holder. The engineer said, based on the coding style, this was written about 4 years ago. That's around when the company first faced that hostile short-selling attack overseas. That was handled by Marcus Webb's team. Marcus says it wasn't him. Says he went to sleep one night with the company under heavy attack and woke up to find the positions already hedged. He always assumed it was a natural market correction. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Forget it for now. It's a dormant program. It won't touch daily operations. Owen nodded and left. 3 days later, on a Thursday, Callaway Holdings stock dropped 7% at the opening bell. By the time Nathaniel reached the trading floor at 8:45 that morning, the head trader's shirt was already soaked through with sweat. What's happening? Nathaniel said. It wasn't really a question. The trader turned a screen toward him, red numbers cascading. Someone's shorting us. Coordinated, and it's massive. Positions opening in Singapore, the Caymans, and London, all at once. Early estimates put it north of $5 billion. Who? We're still tracing it, but whoever's behind this is extremely sophisticated. A web of shell entities layered several deep. And Mr. Callaway, this isn't random. They're going straight for our exposure in 3 specific overseas projects. It's almost like they knew exactly where our defenses were before they started. Nathaniel's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. 3 projects, 3 vectors. What about the hedging programs? The trader's face had gone pale. That's the problem, sir. They went dormant a week ago, all 6 of them. We're completely exposed. The room went silent for 3 full seconds. Nathaniel stood without moving, his hands slowly closing into fists at his sides. Why wasn't I told about this sooner? Risk management said they reported it to your office. I never received it. His voice had gone cold. Activate the backup protocols, now. There are no backup protocols, the trader said quietly. Those 6 programs were the backup protocol, the final line of defense. Nobody on our current team understands their internal logic well enough to reverse engineer them. Then write new ones. Sir, the attack has already started. Programs of that complexity would take at least 2 weeks to build from scratch. We don't have 2 weeks. Nathaniel turned and walked back to his office. He dialed my number. No longer in service. He dialed again. Same result. He set the phone down and sat behind his desk, staring out at a city that looked, from that height, exactly like it had 10 days earlier. But something underneath it had shifted, and he couldn't yet name what. Thursday afternoon, the stock kept falling, closing down 12%. Friday, another 9%. 2 days, nearly $1.5 billion gone. Nathaniel made over 100 calls in 48 hours, brought in emergency risk consultants from 3 different investment banks, spent $12 million on advisory fees alone. Every single consultant reached the same conclusion. The attack was too precise, too well-timed, to be anything other than the work of someone who'd once been on the inside. If they couldn't rebuild a hedging barrier within 72 hours, $3 billion in overseas assets would be sitting completely exposed. On Saturday, at 2 a.m, Nathaniel sat alone in his office with 3 emergency reports spread out in front of him, 1 from each investment bank. Every report pointed to the same dead end. They needed the original key holder. There was no substitute for it. He dialed my number for what felt, he told me later, like the 1,000th time. Still dead. Then he did something he'd never done before in 4 years of marriage. He opened my personal email account. He knew the password. He'd set the account up for me himself back when we first got married, back when that had felt like a kindness rather than a leash. The inbox was empty. Every message deleted. Even the trash folder had been emptied. He logged into the company's internal directory next and searched my name. 0 records. I had never left a single trace inside Callaway Holdings. No employee file, no login history, no email correspondence anywhere in the system. As far as the company's records were concerned, I had never existed there at all. But someone had written those 6 programs. The following Monday, at the Global Finance Summit Gala at the Ashworth Hotel, Nathaniel showed up with one goal: find anyone in that room who could help him build a temporary hedge before the 72 hours ran out. The guest list that night was a who's who of the financial world, and as he walked in, he could feel the shift in how people looked at him. Word of the stock collapse had already spread through every circle that mattered. He found his first real target quickly. Julian Ashford, founder of Meridian Capital in Singapore, one of the largest long-short funds in Asia, a white-haired man in his 60s with a reputation for saying exactly what he thought and nothing else. Julian, Ashford turned, a faint smile already forming. Nathaniel, sit. Exactly what he thought and nothing else. Julian, Ashford turned, a faint smile already forming. Nathaniel, sit. They found a quiet corner. Nathaniel didn't waste time. Julian, we're having some trouble with our overseas positions. I need a temporary hedging solution. I know, Ashford said, swirling his drink. The whole market knows your 6 programs went dark. Whoever's on the other side of this trade knows it too, and they're hitting you exactly where it hurts. Nathaniel's hand tightened slightly around his glass. You know about the programs? Ashford gave him a look that wasn't quite pity, something closer to genuine surprise. Nathaniel, those 6 programs are something of a legend in certain circles. 4 years ago, when you first got shorted, whoever countered that attack wiped the opposing position out completely in 36 hours. People spent years trying to figure out who was behind it. The technique was... elegant isn't even the right word. The way they used information asymmetry, the timing across multiple markets, the coordination. It's still considered one of the cleanest risk operations anyone's seen in this region in the last decade. Nathaniel said nothing. You genuinely don't know who did it? My risk director's team. Ashford laughed, and it wasn't a kind sound. Nathaniel, I know Marcus Webb. He's competent. That level of strategy is not Marcus Webb. That was the work of somebody operating on an entirely different level. He set his glass down. 2 years ago, one of your overseas projects got targeted again. I happened to be on the other side of that particular trade, nothing personal, just an overlapping position. I put on a heavy short, ready to take a piece of you. Overnight, I got countered and lost close to $800 million. He paused. I spent 3 months trying to find out who'd done it. All I ever found was an offshore account registered in Greece. The trading commands required a biometric key, fingerprints plus iris. That's where the trail went completely cold. Greece. The word landed in Nathaniel's chest like something sharp. Then, Ashford went on, last year, at a conference, A few of us were talking about who the best risk strategist in the region had been over the last 5 years. Somebody brought up a name. Nathaniel stared at him. Ashford set his glass down entirely. Vivian Winters, he said, and the two words landed softly, almost gently, in a way that made them land harder. Your wife, he added, watching Nathaniel's face carefully. She doesn't operate under her real name in the industry, but the biometric data on the master key traces to her. A handful of people had already figured it out. Every single time Callaway Holdings has been pulled back from the edge in the last 4 years, it wasn't your risk team. It was her, alone, working from somewhere in the dark, while everyone assumed it was luck. Nathaniel's breath caught audibly. Ashford leaned back into the sofa, watching him now the way you'd watch a play you already knew the ending to. So now you're coming to me. You want me to fill in for your wife. He shook his head slightly. Nathaniel, I'll be honest with you. It's not that I won't help. I can't. The logic behind those 6 programs belongs to her and no one else. They weren't generic models. They were built, piece by piece, for the exact shape of your company's exposure. You could bring in the entire global risk desk at Goldman Sachs and it wouldn't matter. Without her keys, without her strategic logic, none of it works. He clapped Nathaniel on the shoulder, almost gently. Find your wife. Nathaniel sat there while the sound of the gala faded around him into something distant and unimportant. 4 years, 6 programs. Greece. He remembered the empty email account, the open safe, the missing folder from the nightstand drawer. He remembered my voice on the phone 10 days earlier, saying, "The baby's gone," in a tone so flat it had sounded like I was describing something that had happened to a stranger. He understood now, sitting in that ballroom, that the flatness hadn't been indifference at all. It had been resolve. He stood, his legs briefly unsteady beneath him. A shame, Julian Ashford murmured to himself, watching Nathaniel's back retreat toward the door. Such a shame. In the hallway outside, Nathaniel leaned against the wall and dialed Renee Foss's office directly. Foss Law. I need to speak with Vivian Winters. A pause. May I ask who's calling? Nathaniel Callaway, her husband. A 2-second silence. Mr. Callaway, I'm afraid Miss Foss isn't available at the moment. This isn't a legal matter. I need to contact my wife. You have her information. Mr. Callaway, per our client agreement, we're not authorized to share Miss Winters' contact information with any third party. I'm her husband. Yes, sir, but Miss Winters' instructions were explicit. No one, including her spouse, is to be given that information. His knuckles went white around the phone. Put Renee on the line. Tell her it's about Callaway Holdings. Tell her it's urgent. Hold music. A minute later, a calm, professional voice. Mr. Callaway, how can I help you? Where is she? I'm afraid I can't answer that. She filed for divorce. I don't agree to it. I'll convey your position, but the agreement has already been executed and is currently undergoing notarization. If you refuse to sign, we'll proceed through the courts. Let me talk to her. Miss Winters has instructed that all communication go through me. She won't be contacting you directly. Nathaniel closed his eyes. Renee, I know she's angry. I take full responsibility for what happened with the baby, but we can work through this. A brief silence. Mr. Callaway, I'm not a marriage counselor. My job is to carry out my client's wishes, and her wishes are extremely clear. A divorce, no assets, Only her freedom. If there's no other legal matter, I'll be ending this call. Wait! A beat. How is she? Renee didn't answer that question. Good night, Mr. Calloway. The line went dead. He stood in the hallway holding the phone, the light from the ballroom warm and golden behind him, the hallway itself dark. He put the phone back in his pocket and walked toward the elevators. In the parking garage, he sat in his car without starting the engine, gripping the wheel until his fingers went white. 4 years. I had stood behind him invisibly, shielding him from every danger he never even saw coming, and he had known absolutely nothing about it. And now I was gone. The following week, the stock kept sliding. By Wednesday, there were margin calls. By Thursday, overseas partners were simultaneously issuing ultimatums demanding additional collateral. Within 7 days, Callaway Holdings had fallen from a $5 billion valuation to $2.6 billion, then $2.4, then lower still. Nathaniel sat through 16 hours of emergency board meetings, and every proposal that came to the table died on the same point. It required reactivating the 6 programs, and the only person who could do that was somewhere in Greece and showed no signs of coming back. When the last meeting of that stretch finally ended, it was 2 a.m, and everyone had gone home. Nathaniel sat alone at the head of the conference table, surrounded by scattered reports. One of them was a technical summary from the IT department detailing the biometric verification tied to the master keys. Keyholder, Vivian Winters. First registered 4 years ago, March 17th. He sat with that date for a long time before it meant anything to him. Then he remembered. It was the day after the company's very first hostile short-selling attack. He'd come home that night in a black mood and dropped onto the sofa without a word to anyone. I'd been in the kitchen. I brought him a bowl of soup and set it on the coffee table. "Drink this first," I'd said. He hadn't touched it. He'd been on his phone, messaging Brooke. I'd stood there for a moment, and then I'd taken the soup back to the kitchen. He remembered, he told me this himself, much later, hearing it get poured down the drain. He'd worked until 3 that morning. By the next day, the short sellers had been completely wiped out, and he'd always assumed it was Marcus Webb's team. It turned out I hadn't slept that night either. I'd been writing code, alone, in the room down the hall from him. He'd never once asked me what I was doing up so late. Not once in 4 years. He closed the report. Then he did another useless thing. He dialed the dead number one more time. No longer in service. He set the phone down on the table hard enough to crack the screen. 3 weeks after I left, Nathaniel came home to Wyndham Court at 1 a.m. The lock read his fingerprint, and the entryway light came on automatically, and he stood in the doorway without moving for a long moment. The house was dark. No one had left a light on for him. He remembered, standing there, that there had always been a small nightlight left burning in the upstairs hallway, no matter how late he came in. A warm, faint yellow glow you could see all the way from the front door. It wasn't there anymore. He changed his shoes and walked into the living room. The wedding photo was still face down on the coffee table where I'd left it. He hadn't touched it in 3 weeks. He went upstairs. The bed had been made that morning by the cleaning service. The distance between his side of the mattress and mine looked, suddenly, enormous. He opened the closet. The 3 racks on the left were empty. Not the kind of empty they'd been that first night, when the clothes were still there, but I wasn't. This was a different kind of absence. Total, deliberate, clean. 3 days earlier, he'd told the housekeeper to pack up my things and ship them somewhere. Ship them where? She'd asked. He hadn't known. Just hold on to them for now, he'd said. Now the clothes were simply gone. He called Marisol. Where are Ms. Winter's clothes? Mr. Calloway, what clothes? The ones on the left side of the closet. They were there. Oh, people from her lawyer's office came for them today. They said Ms. Winters had authorized them to handle her belongings. They had paperwork, so I let them in. His hand tightened around the phone. When? Around 2. You were in your meeting. 2 women came with boxes. They had everything packed within half an hour. He hung up and stood in the closet. Nothing remained on the left-hand racks. Not a single hanger out of place. Not even a lingering trace of the perfume I used to wear. On the right, his own clothes hung neatly, undisturbed, exactly as they'd always been. And for a moment, the whole closet looked like it had only ever belonged to one person. He reached out and touched an empty metal hanger. It was cold. He went through the rest of the house the same way. The vanity drawers, empty. The jewelry box, empty. The bathroom counter, cleared of every bottle and jar that had ever been mine. In the shower, my shampoo, my loofah, the wooden comb I'd had since college, all gone. In the study, my laptop was gone. In the front hall, my shoes were gone. In the kitchen, the plain white mug I always drank my coffee from, gone. Every single trace of me had been removed from that house, methodically, precisely, down to the last strand of hair caught in a hairbrush. Nathaniel ended up standing in front of the living room's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the quiet, expensive, empty street, and then at his own reflection in the glass. 3 weeks. He hadn't flown to Athens. He couldn't. The company crisis had him pinned in place, an endless rotation of emergency meetings, debt restructuring calls, investor negotiations, and Renee Foss's firm was an iron wall around me. He'd told himself it was temporary, that when the anger passed, when all of this settled, I would, he realized, standing there, that he had no idea how that sentence was supposed to end. His phone rang. Owen, calling at 1:15 in the morning. Mr. Calloway, I'm so sorry to call this late. We've received formal notice from Foss Law. They're requesting you sign the divorce agreement in person tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you don't cooperate, the next step is a direct filing with the court. His jaw tightened. Will she be there in person? The notice says Miss Foss will be attending herself. Miss Winters will not be present. Fine, he said. 10 a.m. He hung up. The next morning, at 9:45, Nathaniel sat in his office on the 32nd floor of the Calloway Holdings Tower. The coffee in front of him had gone cold an hour ago. At 9:50, Owen knocked. Miss Foss has arrived, sir. Send her in. The door opened, and it wasn't one person. It was 3. Renee led the way, a woman in her 40s, short hair, a black suit that didn't apologize for anything. Behind her, a younger associate and a man carrying a folder of notarization documents. Renee didn't bother with pleasantries. She sat down across from Nathaniel, opened her briefcase, and set a document on the desk. Mr. Calloway, this is the final version of the divorce agreement on behalf of my client, Miss Vivian Winters. I believe you've already seen the contents. He had. Owen had forwarded him a scan 3 weeks earlier. He'd torn the printout to pieces. I'm not signing. Renee looked up, entirely unsurprised, as if she'd budgeted for exactly this response. She pulled a second document from her briefcase. In that case, this is Plan B, a copy of a court petition. If you don't sign today, we file this formally within 72 hours. Given the defendant's ongoing marital infidelity, which we're prepared to substantiate thoroughly, the outcome of any judgment isn't really in question. What evidence? Renee smiled faintly, without any warmth in it. Mr. Calloway, do you genuinely want to discuss the evidence here, in this room? His jaw tightened. I want to see Vivian. Ms. Winters doesn't wish to see you. This conversation is between her and me. You're only a lawyer. Renee set her pen down and folded her hands on the table. Mr. Calloway, I am indeed only a lawyer, which means I only speak to matters within the scope of the law. A pause. Ms. Winters has waived her rights to all community property. Under current law, that means she walks away with nothing. 4 years of marriage, and she leaves with absolutely nothing. All that's required of you is a signature. I don't want her to walk away with nothing. I don't want a divorce. You don't want a divorce, Renee repeated, flat, as if reciting an unremarkable fact. But Mr. Calloway, Ms. Winters does. He said nothing. Renee let 5 seconds pass before continuing. I took this case the day after Ms. Winters had emergency surgery. She discharged herself from the hospital against medical advice, took a cab to my office in a hospital gown and slippers borrowed from a nurse, with blood still seeping through the gauze on her abdomen. His eyelid twitched. The first thing she said, sitting down across from me, was, I want a divorce. I don't want any property. I just want my freedom. Renee looked at him directly. Mr. Calloway, in 12 years of practice, I've watched people cry through this process, fight over furniture, fight over dogs. I have never once watched someone still actively bleeding from major surgery say the words, I just want my freedom, with that kind of calm. She let that sit. So I find myself wondering what exactly a person has to go through to reach the point where personal freedom is the only thing left she wants. Renee, his voice had gone low. I know what you think of me. But what happened between Vivian and me isn't for an outsider to judge. I know I was wrong that night. That night, Renee cut in. Are you certain it was only that one night? He froze. From the bottom of her briefcase, Renee lifted a thin folder, maybe a dozen pages. This is material Miss Winters authorized me to present if it became necessary. Read it. If you still refuse to sign afterward, we'll see you in court. She slid it across the desk. He stared at the plain beige folder for a moment before opening it. The first page, a screenshot of a flight itinerary, departure date 3 weeks earlier, destination, Athens. The second page, a copy of a Greek permanent residency card issued 3 years ago. He hadn't known. The third page, an offshore bank statement, a Zurich account under the name Vivian Winters. He looked at the balance. His fingers went numb. 9 figures. He had never once known she had that kind of money. The fourth page, an internal technical report titled Core Hedging Program, Master Keyholder Trace. A line circled in red ink. Keyholder, Vivian Winters. First registration, 4 years ago, March 17th. He already knew this piece from Julian Ashford, but seeing it in black and white, printed and official, still landed like a fist to the sternum. Pages 5 through 10, operational records for every short-selling attack the company had faced across the last 4 years. 6 incidents in total. The command issuer for every counter-operation traced back to the same offshore account. Mine. The last page held a single handwritten line. This is a record of everything I did for Calloway Holdings over 4 years. I'm done now. Nathaniel closed the folder. His hand rested on top of it, unmoving. "Mr. Calloway," Renee's voice from across the table. "Do you have anything else to say?" He looked up. Her expression wasn't pity, and it wasn't anger. It was something colder than either. "I have a personal question for you, if you'll allow it," she said. "Purely out of curiosity, not as part of my professional duties." He didn't answer. "That night, your wife, 7 months pregnant, fell in the bathroom and started hemorrhaging. She called you 5 times. You didn't answer a single one. She walked barefoot down a main road trying to hail a cab, and every car in the city had already been chartered by you. A driver finally took her to the hospital, risking his own bonus to do it." A pause. "Where were you in that hour?" His throat worked, but nothing came out. "You were downtown, one hand holding another woman's son, the other on that woman's waist, smiling up at a sky full of pink screens. I didn't know. You didn't know." Renee nodded slowly. "Right. You didn't know anything. You didn't know she was miscarrying. You didn't know she signed her own surgical consent form because there was no one else to sign it. You didn't know she spent the night alone in a recovery room." She stood. "And you didn't know that for 4 years, every time this company came within a hair of collapsing, it was her, at 3 a.m, alone at a laptop, quietly patching every hole you never even noticed was there." She closed her briefcase and stood beside the table looking down at him. "Mr. Calloway, one last thing. Miss Winters asked me to relay 2 words to you." A pause. "Whatever you want, sign it or don't. She's no longer invested in the outcome." To her, this agreement is a formality at this point. Her life, her money, her identity, none of it requires your name anymore. She walked toward the door, then paused, one hand on the knob. "But if you insist on dragging this out in court, all of this material becomes public record, including every dollar, every property, every expense disguised as a PR event that Miss Sinclair has received from you over the last 4 years. I'm genuinely curious what that number comes to." She turned to leave, then stopped, as if she'd nearly forgotten something. "Oh, and everyone in this building saw me walk in." The door opened. In the hallway, 7 or 8 people stood around in various states of pretending not to be there, some feigning a walk to the break room, some frozen mid-conversation with coffee mugs in hand, several clustered near Owen's desk, watching openly. They'd all seen Renee Foss arrive with the briefcase. And in the few seconds the door stood open, they'd all seen Nathaniel Calloway sitting alone at his desk, a folder open in front of him, his face gone the color of ash. Renee walked past all of them, her heels sharp against the tile. Near the elevator, a voice called out behind her. The head of the legal department, a woman in her 50s who'd been with the company for 8 years. "Miss Foss!" Renee turned. The woman crossed to her, holding a brown envelope. "This is my resignation letter. Could you pass it along to Ms. Winters for me?" She hesitated, pushing her glasses up. "Tell her, we all knew who was really holding this company together all these years." Renee took the envelope. The elevator arrived. As the doors closed, she caught sight of 2 more employees approaching with envelopes of their own. Back in his office, Nathaniel was still in his chair, the folder still open to that last handwritten page. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. My name was gone from his contacts, but he still remembered the number by heart. He dialed it anyway. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He knew it would say that. He dialed it anyway. A small daily ritual, he told me later. Just to confirm, over and over, that I was really and truly gone. His door opened a crack. Owen. Sir, the head of legal, the director of risk, and the senior trading analyst have all submitted their resignations. Understood. Should I try to talk any of them into staying? No. Owen retreated. Nathaniel stood and walked to the window. From the 32nd floor, the whole city spread out beneath him, and 3 weeks earlier he would have told you all of it belonged to him in some fundamental way. This building, this view, everything visible from up here. What actually belonged to him now? The company's value had fallen from $5 billion to $1.8 billion and was still falling. The short sellers circled like they could smell blood in the water, because they could. Without my hedging programs, his risk team was, in Renee's phrase that would circulate through the company for months afterward, a squad of deaf goalkeepers. Investors were pulling out. Partners wanted more collateral. Banks were quietly reviewing his credit lines. And his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, was somewhere in Greece, by the sea, holding the only key that could fix any of it. And she was not coming back. He turned from the window, sat back down, and picked up the agreement Renee had left on his desk. 8 pages. He read the third clause again. Full and unrestricted personal freedom. He picked up his pen and held it over the signature line for a long time. He didn't sign it. He closed the folder, put it in a drawer, and picked up his phone to dial a different number entirely. Book me a flight to Athens. Tomorrow. I only ever heard about the board meetings in fragments, mostly from Renee, who heard them from a former colleague who represented one of the outside directors. But I've reconstructed the shape of them enough times since that I think I can tell it accurately, or close enough to accurately that the difference doesn't much matter anymore. The board of Callaway Holdings had 11 members by the time the collapse began in earnest. 6 of them holdovers from Nathaniel's father's era, men in their 60s and 70s who'd watched the old man build the company from a regional lending operation into something with real global reach, and who had, by most accounts, spent the first several years of Nathaniel's tenure indulging him the particular patience boards extend to young heirs. A patience that runs out, eventually, and runs out fast once the numbers stop cooperating. The meeting that mattered most, the one Renee's contact described in the most detail, happened on a Tuesday in late November, 6 weeks after the first short attack, by which point the company's value had fallen by more than half and showed no sign of finding a floor. Nathaniel presented 3 separate recovery plans that afternoon, each one more elaborate than the last, each one built around some version of the same impossible assumption, that a new team, given enough time and enough money, could reverse engineer 6 years of proprietary risk architecture from scratch, under active fire, in a matter of weeks. One of the older directors, a man named Whitfield who'd sat on that board for over 20 years and rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, apparently interrupted the third presentation about 10 minutes in. "Nathaniel," he said, according to the account that eventually reached Renee, "I've sat through a great many crisis presentations in my career. I have never once sat through one where the actual solution to the problem was sitting somewhere the company could not or would not reach out to. Where is she?" The room had gone quiet. Nathaniel, by every account, didn't answer the question directly. He said something about ongoing efforts, about legal complexities, about the situation being personal in nature and not something he could discuss in a board setting. "With respect," Whitfield reportedly said, "you made it a board matter the moment it started costing shareholders $2 billion. I don't care about the personal complexities. I care about the fact that the person capable of fixing this is, from what I understand, entirely willing to be found, and simply doesn't want anything more to do with this company or with you. Those are two very different problems, and only one of them is actually solvable in a boardroom. Nathaniel didn't have an answer for that either. The vote to begin formal liquidation proceedings passed 9-2 3 weeks later, and the two dissenting votes, I'm told, weren't dissenting because they believed in a different outcome. They simply couldn't bring themselves to be the ones to formally end something that had carried the family name for 3 generations. I understand that impulse, even if I can't say I feel much sympathy for the men who held it. Sentiment is an expensive thing to indulge with other people's money, and every one of those directors, in the end, understood the arithmetic perfectly well. They simply didn't want to be the one to say it out loud first. I've wondered, since, whether Nathaniel ever seriously considered simply calling me directly, through Renee's wall or around it, and making his case plainly, professionally, the way you'd make a case to any other estranged business partner. Not an apology, not a plea, just a straightforward offer, whatever terms I might have wanted, in exchange for reactivating the 6 programs and saving what could still be saved. I think, in his position, a more calculating man would have tried it. I think, in some strange way, the fact that he never did try it, that every approach he made was personal, emotional, aimed at winning me back rather than simply solving the business problem in front of him, is the one piece of evidence in this entire story that suggests he actually loved me, underneath everything else, in whatever broken, badly expressed way he was capable of. It didn't change anything. I want to be clear about that. But I've come to believe it all the same, somewhere in the 2 years since. He never once, not even with everything on the line, tried to buy the solution to his problem. He only ever tried to win back the person. He simply started trying about 4 years and one tragedy too late for it to matter anymore. News travels strangely inside a company that's dying. I heard, secondhand, from Renee, who heard it from people who still felt some old loyalty to a name that used to mean something, on my end of things, not his, that the mood inside the Callaway Holdings Tower in those final weeks was less like panic and more like a very slow, very public exhumation. The financial press, which had spent a small fortune of column inches that October writing about the most romantic gesture the city had ever seen, spent November and December writing something considerably less flattering. A junior reporter at one of the business dailies got hold of the timeline first, the hospital admission time, the emergency call logs, the exact hour the surge pricing notification had gone out to every driver in the metro area, and ran a piece with a headline that Renee read to me over the phone in a voice that had, for once, lost its usual professional flatness. The $20 million night. What was happening across town while Callaway celebrated? It didn't accuse him of anything illegal, because there wasn't anything illegal in it, not technically. It simply laid the 2 nights side by side, his and mine, in a long, careful, factual column, hour by hour, and let the juxtaposition do whatever it was going to do to the people reading it. It did quite a lot, as it turned out. The comments underneath the original birthday coverage, the ones that had once read so romantic, "This is what true love looks like," filled up within days with a different tone entirely. People are cruel in both directions with equal enthusiasm, I've noticed. And cruelty aimed correctly for once doesn't feel quite the same as cruelty aimed at nothing. Inside the company itself, the departures kept coming for weeks after the first wave. The head of legal was only the beginning. A risk analyst who'd worked under Marcus Webb for 6 years left a note on her way out that supposedly read, in full, "I built my entire career on the assumption I understood how this place stayed alive. I didn't. Good luck to whoever's still here when the truth catches up completely." Owen stayed the longest of anyone close to Nathaniel, which surprised no one who'd ever met Owen. He had the particular dogged loyalty of a person who'd built his whole professional identity around being indispensable to someone else. And men like that rarely leave until there's genuinely nothing left to be indispensable to.
Marcus Webb, for what it's worth, gave one interview during all of this to a trade publication, and Renee forwarded it to me because she thought, correctly, that I'd want to see it eventually, even if I didn't want to see it right away. He didn't defend the company. He didn't defend Nathaniel. He talked, at some length, and with what read like genuine, belated humility, about spending 4 years quietly accepting credit for work he now understood he hadn't done. About a level of skill in those 6 programs that he said, in his own words, operated on a plane I'm not sure I could reach with a decade of preparation. He didn't name me. I think, by then, everyone who mattered already knew, and the not naming was its own kind of respect. Julian Ashford, I learned much later, made exactly one public comment on the entire collapse. At an investor dinner someone recorded on their phone, and that eventually made its way around the same small gossiping circles that finance people always travel in. Someone asked him, half as a joke, whether he'd consider buying up what was left of Callaway Holdings at the bottom. He reportedly laughed, not unkindly, and said, "There's nothing left to buy. The only asset that company ever actually had left 4 months ago. And she's not for sale." Nobody who heard it needed the sentence explained to them. I read almost none of this as it happened. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting on my terrace in Santorini refreshing financial news the way people imagine wronged women do in these stories, tracking every headline like a scoreboard. Renee would summarize things for me in short, factual bursts when we spoke. The way you'd update someone on weather in a city they used to live in. Informative, but not urgent. I let most of it wash past me. I had, by then, mostly stopped needing it to mean anything. But I'll admit that a few pieces of it did land somewhere, despite my best efforts. The resignation letter from the head of legal, the one about who'd really been holding the company together, sat with me longer than I expected it to. Not because it changed anything about my decision, it didn't, but because it was, as far as I could tell, the first time in 4 years that anyone inside that building had said the true shape of things out loud, where it could be heard, without my having to say it myself. There's a particular quiet relief in being seen accurately by strangers after years of being systematically unseen by the one person who was supposed to be paying the closest attention. I hadn't expected that relief. I've come to think it's one of the more honest gifts the whole ordeal gave me. The next day, in the airport's first-class lounge, Nathaniel sat with his boarding pass in hand. Flight CA-973 to Athens. His phone rang. Renee. "Mr. Callaway, I understand you've booked a flight to Athens?" "How did you know that?" "That's not important." Her voice was flat, precise. "I'm simply reminding you that Miss Winters' current address is protected under Greek privacy law. Even if you land in Athens, you will not find her. And if you attempt to obtain her address through any improper means, we'll file for a restraining order with the Greek courts immediately. At that point, you won't just fail to find her. You may find yourself barred from the country entirely." His jaw clenched. "Does she hate me that much?" A pause. "Mr. Callaway, this isn't hate. Hate requires caring." The line went dead. He sat holding the phone in the lounge as his flight was called for final boarding. He didn't know what street I lived on, what building, what my new number was. He knew nothing. The same way, for 4 years, he'd known nothing. He hadn't known I was writing code for him at 3 in the morning. He hadn't known about the 9-figure account. He hadn't known about the residency card. He hadn't known his son was dying that night while he stood under pink light with someone else's child on his shoulders. He hadn't known I signed the consent form alone. He hadn't known I walked barefoot down a public road, bleeding, unable to find a single car in a city he'd rented out entirely for someone else. Final boarding call for flight CA973 to Athens. He stood. Then he sat back down. He looked at the boarding pass in his hand for a few seconds, and then he tore it cleanly in half, and then in half again, and let the pieces fall onto the lounge carpet. What would he even do if he went? What would he say if he somehow found me? I wouldn't want to see him. I hadn't left so much as a single sock behind in that house. He stood and walked toward the exit instead. His phone rang again before he reached the doors. Owen. "Sir, the bank's on the line. They're saying if we can't produce additional collateral by Monday, they'll begin forced liquidation of assets." "How much?" $870 million. He stood in front of the terminal's automatic doors as they slid open, letting in a gust of cold November air. "I'm heading back to the office," he said. 1 month later, the company was in genuine free fall. The day before the final creditors' meeting that would decide its fate, Nathaniel drove to Union Memorial Hospital. He used his standing as my legal husband to demand a meeting with the physician who'd treated me that night. Some last, desperate reach for a piece of the puzzle that might explain why I'd left so completely, so surgically, without a trace. Dr. Patel, a woman in her early 30s, sat behind her desk and looked at the haggard, hollowed-out man across from her for a long moment before speaking. "You want her records, Mr. Calloway?" Her voice was quiet in a way that was more dangerous than shouting would have been. "You want to understand why she disappeared?" "Just tell me what happened that night," he said. She opened a file and set a document down on the desk with more force than it needed. "The night she arrived, your wife was in active hemorrhage, placental abruption. She'd lost nearly a liter of blood by the time she reached us." His fingers went still. "She was 28 weeks pregnant. The fetus did not survive." Her gaze bored into him. The room went completely silent. He sat there without moving, the fingers of his right hand slowly curling into a fist. "I know," he said, barely above a whisper. "You know." Dr. Patel's voice rose sharply, all professional distance gone from it now. "What exactly do you know? Do you know how she got here?" "On foot. Barefoot. In pre-shock." The surgical consent form was signed by the patient. The family member line was left blank. "We called you 5 times. She pulled one final item from the file, a color photograph, and set it face up on the desk in front of him. "Since you came here today requesting her file as her husband, here it is. The fetal autopsy photo." Nathaniel looked down. His whole body went rigid. A tiny, curled, purple form. His son. 28 weeks along, formed enough to have fingers, toes, closed eyes. 2 pounds, 6 ounces. "If she'd reached us within 30 minutes, Dr. Patel said, without an ounce of mercy in her voice, he had roughly a 70% chance. It took her nearly 2 hours because she couldn't get a car, because you took every car in the city and pointed them somewhere else." She let that land. "Your son," she said, tapping the photo once, "is dead." His heart stopped at approximately 11:15 that night. Where were you at 11:15?
You were standing in a plaza lit up in pink, holding another woman's son on your shoulders. Stop. He forced the word out, his whole body shaking now. I will not stop. She was on my table for 2 hours. When she woke up, she didn't cry. She just put her hand on her stomach and left it there. Do you have any idea what it feels like to lose a child that was already kicking you every single morning like clockwork? His body convulsed. He slid forward off the chair until his knees hit the cold floor, his hands pressed against his skull, a low, guttural, wordless sound tearing out of his throat. Dr. Patel stood. Take your files, Mr. Calloway, and get out of my office. I've treated a lot of terrible men in this job. You are in a category by yourself. That afternoon, Nathaniel walked into the Calloway Holdings creditors meeting looking like a hollowed-out version of the man who'd built the company back up 4 years earlier. He didn't fight the liquidation. He didn't argue a single point. He signed the bankruptcy paperwork with a bandaged, bleeding hand. He'd apparently cut it earlier that day and never had it looked at, his mind still trapped somewhere in a cold examination room with the photograph of a boy who never opened his eyes. That night, he sat alone on the floor of his dark living room, staring at a photo he'd taken of the photo Dr. Patel had left on her desk. He sat there for a long time, trying to think of a name for his son, and every time he got close, he heard Dr. Patel's voice again in his head, every single morning like clockwork, and his mind went blank all over again. A call came in from Brooke. He let it go to voicemail. A message played automatically. Nate, don't listen to what people are saying online. It wasn't your fault she fell. You shouldn't feel guilty. I'm worried about you. Maybe I should come by. He threw the phone against the wall hard enough to crack the screen, but the message kept playing anyway, warped and broken. Are you there? Milo keeps asking when you're taking him to the amusement park like you promised. Milo, Brooke's son, the boy who'd sat on his shoulders that night, laughing, while his own son was dying 2 hours across the city. He didn't sleep at all that night. In the days that followed, according to what Renee eventually pieced together and later relayed to me, he stopped answering calls from almost everyone. He lost weight rapidly. He was, by every account she heard, a man coming apart at every seam that had ever held him together. I never spoke to Brooke Sinclair, not once, in 4 years of marriage or afterward. I want to say that plainly, because I think these stories sometimes invite you to imagine some dramatic confrontation between the wife and the other woman that never actually happened here. There was no scene. There was no phone call where I said everything I'd apparently been saving up. She simply existed at the edge of my marriage for 4 years. A name on a corporate calendar, a smiling face on a billboard 3 stories tall, and then, eventually, she stopped existing at the edge of anything of mine at all. What I know about what happened to her afterward, I know secondhand, the way I know most of the rest of this, filtered through Renee, through the occasional headline, through the strange, persistent gossip network that seems to survive every collapse a company like Nathaniel's goes through. From what I understand, the money stopped almost immediately once the liquidation began. The corporate PR event, as Nathaniel had once tried to call it to my face, had in fact been funded almost entirely out of his personal accounts, which meant that when those accounts got frozen and then seized as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, whatever arrangement had existed between them evaporated along with everything else. She gave one interview, months later, to a gossip outlet that specializes in exactly this kind of aftermath, the wreckage left behind once a scandal has fully run its course, and the principal characters are picking through the rubble for whatever's left of their reputations. She described herself, in that interview, as having had no idea about the wife's situation that night, which may well have been true, and as being as shocked as anyone by everything that came out afterward, which I found somewhat harder to credit, though I recognize I'm not an unbiased judge of her honesty. I felt, reading the small excerpt Renee eventually forwarded me, I never sought out the full piece, something closer to a kind of distant, almost clinical curiosity than anything sharper. I'd expected, if I ever encountered anything about her again, to feel something large and ugly rise up in me. It didn't happen. I think by the time that interview ran, I'd already done whatever internal accounting I needed to do about my own marriage, and Brooke Sinclair, whatever her culpability, had simply never been the real subject of that accounting. Nathaniel had chosen where his attention went every single day for 4 years. She hadn't forced anything. She'd simply been available in a way I'd apparently stopped being, or had never fully managed to be. And I found I couldn't hold on to much anger toward a woman for accepting affection that was being freely, repeatedly offered to her by someone else's husband. Her son, I understand, is doing fine. I want to say that clearly because he's the one entirely innocent person in this whole story. A small boy who has no idea he sat on a stranger's shoulders one night, while 2 hours across the city, that stranger's actual son was dying, and who deserves whatever the rest of us deserve, to simply grow up without any of this ever touching him. I hope it never does. I think about him sometimes, oddly not with any complicated feeling at all, just a plain, uncomplicated hope that his life turns out to be a good one, unmarked by anything that happened around him before he was old enough to understand it. Before I tell you about Santorini properly, there's one more thing I want to put down, because it's the only part of that whole terrible night I ever went back to on purpose. About 6 weeks after I landed in Greece, once the worst of the physical recovery was behind me and I'd started sleeping through most nights again, I asked Renee to do something for me that had nothing to do with the divorce. I asked her to find the driver, the third cab, the one who'd finally stopped when 2 others hadn't, the one who'd risked his own night's earnings to take a bleeding, barefoot stranger to the hospital instead of driving her past like the first 2 had. I didn't know his name. I hadn't thought, in the state I was in that night, to ask it, or to note his medallion number, or to do any of the things you'd normally think to do. I only remembered his voice, and the particular, decent hesitation on his face in the rearview mirror before he made his decision. It took Renee's investigator about 2 weeks to track him down through the city's cab licensing records and a rough description of the route and pickup time. His name was Aaron. He'd been driving that route for 11 years. When Renee's associate finally reached him and explained, carefully, who was asking and why, he reportedly went quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said, "Is she okay? I think about that night sometimes. I never found out if she was okay." I had Renee set up a fund in his name, enough to cover a down payment on the house he mentioned wanting to buy his mother, enough that he wouldn't have to drive nights anymore if he didn't want to. I didn't attach my real name to it, and I asked that no explanation be given beyond a note, which I wrote myself and had translated into nothing at all, because I wanted him to read it in the same plain English I'd spoken it to him in the back of his cab. "You were the only person in this city who stopped for me that night. I don't know if you ever think about what would have happened if you'd driven past like the others did. I do. Thank you for being a decent person on a night when almost no one else managed it." The woman in the back seat. I never heard whether he understood who it was from. I didn't need him to. It wasn't really about him knowing. It was about me needing, somewhere in the wreckage of that whole year, to do one thing that was purely about gratitude and nothing else. No strategy in it, no leverage, no long game. Just a woman saying thank you to the one person who'd looked at her, bleeding on a dark street, and chosen to help instead of driving on. I think about him sometimes, still, more than I think about almost anyone else from that night. Not Nathaniel, not Brooke. Aaron, whose last name I still don't actually know, who slowed his cab down when two other men hadn't, purely because something in him wouldn't let him keep driving past a woman who clearly needed help. I've come to think that's the real dividing line in most of these stories, the one that actually matters more than money or betrayal or revenge. Some people slow down. Most people don't. You learn, eventually, exactly which kind of person you're married to, and exactly which kind of person you happen to flag down on a street corner at the worst hour of your life. Not everyone in that world abandoned him, and I think it's worth saying so, because it would be easy, telling this story, to make every person in Nathaniel's orbit into either a villain or a footnote, and that isn't quite honest either. Owen stayed until the very end, through the bankruptcy filing, through the sale of the building, through the slow, humiliating dismantling of a company that had once employed nearly 4,000 people and eventually employed almost none. Renee told me, at one point, almost as an aside, that Owen had taken a substantial pay cut partway through the collapse rather than leave, and had personally handled the outplacement paperwork for over 100 employees who lost their jobs when the company finally folded, making sure each one had at least a severance package and a reference letter before he let himself think about his own situation. I don't know what became of him after that. I hope, whatever it was good. He'd spent years being loyal to the wrong things, in my estimation, but the loyalty itself, misapplied as it was, struck me as real. Marisol left the house on Wyndham Court within a week of my departure, once it became clear the marriage wasn't recovering, and took a position with a family 2 streets over who, according to the small, occasional update Renee passed along, apparently adored her within a month. I was glad to hear it. She'd been kind to me in small, quiet ways over 4 years. An extra blanket left on my side of the bed during a cold spell Nathaniel never noticed. A cup of tea appearing at my elbow on days she could tell, without my saying anything, that something in the house felt wrong. I never got the chance to thank her properly before I left, and that's one of the very few genuine regrets I carry out of that entire period. That in the speed and necessity of my own departure, I didn't find a way to let the people who'd been decent to me know that I'd noticed, and that it had mattered. Marcus Webb, the risk director who'd unknowingly taken credit for 4 years of my work, resurfaced about a year later at a smaller firm in a considerably more junior role than the one he'd held at Callaway Holdings. Renee mentioned it to me almost in passing, and I found, turning it over afterward, that I didn't feel any satisfaction in his demotion the way I might have expected to. He hadn't lied, as far as I ever learned. He'd simply never asked hard enough questions about his own good fortune, which is a very common and very human failure, one I'm not sure I can entirely condemn a person for, given how long I sat inside my own life without asking hard enough questions of my own. I think what I want to say, putting all of this down, is that very few people in this story were purely anything. Nathaniel wasn't purely a villain, even if the worst night of my life happened because of choices he made. Owen wasn't purely loyal in some noble, uncomplicated sense. His loyalty had blind spots that cost people, including me, quite a lot over the years. Even I wasn't purely the wronged party in every possible reading of these 4 years, though I've made my peace with the parts of my own conduct I'd do differently now. The years I spent shrinking myself instead of simply leaving the moment shrinking stopped feeling survivable. People are complicated, and most of the men and women who moved through this story with me were doing the best they knew how to do with what they'd been given, even when what they were doing wasn't good enough, even when it cost someone everything. That doesn't excuse what happened to me on the night of October 17th. I want to be clear about that too. Understanding a person's failures doesn't obligate you to keep absorbing the cost of them indefinitely. But it does, I think, change the shape of what you carry away from it in the end. I didn't leave Nathaniel Calloway because he was a monster. I left him because I was a person, and I had, somewhere in that bathroom on that particular night, finally run out of any willingness left to keep proving it to him. 3 months after I left, I was on a small terrace above the Aegean, watering a pot of mint, when my phone rang. Renee. Vivian, just so you know, Nathaniel signed. I set the watering can down for a second, then picked it back up. Okay. The divorce is final. You're legally single again. Good. A pause. Also, his health isn't great. He was hospitalized last week. Stomach cancer, from what I've heard. The water kept flowing steadily from the can onto the mint leaves. What does that have to do with me? A 2-second silence on the line. Nothing, just informing you. Thank you, Renee. I hung up. I'd rented a small 3-story villa facing the sea. White stucco walls, blue shutters, the kind of place that looks like it was built specifically to be photographed, and somehow still feels like a real home when you live in it. My days had become very simple. I woke up. I fed the orange cat I'd adopted from a colony near the harbor. I watered the plants on the terrace. I read in the mornings. Sometimes I walked along the water in the evenings. I'd made a small handful of friends. A woman who ran a bookshop, a couple who owned the cafe at the end of my street. None of them knew anything about my life before. Here, I was just a quiet foreign woman who lived alone with an orange cat. I felt nothing about the news of his diagnosis. Not anger, not pity, nothing at all. It was like a cup of water that had gone cold a long time ago. You could shake it as hard as you wanted, and it would never be warm again. The villa had come with the cat, more or less. He'd been living semi-wild near the harbor when I found him, a lean orange tom with a torn ear and no interest in being picked up. And for the first month, he simply appeared on my terrace at odd hours to eat whatever I left out, and then vanished again without ceremony. I named him Fairy because the first time I saw him, he was sitting on a piling by the dock, watching the boats come in like he owned the whole operation. And the name stuck before I decided whether I actually wanted a cat at all. By February, he'd stopped leaving. By March, he'd started sleeping on the foot of my bed, which I understood, without either of us discussing it, to mean he'd made a decision about the two of us that I wasn't in a position to argue with. I made one real friend that winter, a woman named Elena who ran a small bookshop 2 streets back from the water, English titles crammed onto low shelves alongside Greek ones, a cat of her own asleep in the front window most afternoons. I'd gone in looking for something to read in a language that wasn't demanding anything of me, and she'd handed me a worn paperback without asking many questions, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. We became the kind of friends who don't need each other's full histories to enjoy each other's company. She knew I was American, knew I'd left a marriage behind somewhere, and never pushed past the edges of what I offered voluntarily. I liked her enormously for that. I think, if I'm honest, I'd spent 4 years being cataloged and explained by other people, and the relief of being allowed to simply exist in front of someone without an accompanying narrative was its own kind of medicine. "You don't talk about him," Elena said to me once, in March, over coffee on her shop's tiny back patio. She didn't say who him was. She didn't need to. No, I agreed. Good or bad, that not talking? I thought about it honestly before answering, because she'd asked honestly. I think it's just where I am, I said. I don't know yet if it's good. She'd nodded, satisfied with that, and refilled both our cups, and we'd talked about something else entirely, a shipment of books that had gotten held up at customs, a wedding happening down the street that weekend, anything at all that wasn't the life I'd left behind. I came to treasure those conversations more than almost anything else that year. There is a particular, specific relief in being known only for who you are choosing to be now, with no one in the room old enough to compare you to who you used to be. My days settled into a rhythm I hadn't had in longer than I could remember, one that belonged entirely to me, arranged around nothing but my own preferences, for the first time since I was maybe 22 years old. I woke without an alarm most mornings, made coffee slowly, sat on the terrace and watched the light change color over the caldera the way you'd watch something on television, mindlessly and completely absorbed at the same time. I read constantly that first year, novels mostly, nothing that asked much of me emotionally, because I'd used up my capacity for emotional demands elsewhere and needed the books, at least, to simply be company. In the afternoons, I walked, sometimes to the beach, sometimes just through the winding white streets with no destination at all, which had once been the exact kind of purposeless activity Nathaniel would have found faintly ridiculous back when he still noticed how I spent my hours. I thought about the baby less as the months passed, though never in the way people who haven't been through it seem to expect. It wasn't a wound that closed over neatly, more like a low, permanent hum underneath everything else, audible mostly in quiet moments, at 5 a.m. especially, when my body still sometimes woke on its own, waiting for a kick that would never come again. I let myself feel that fully when it happened, rather than pushing it away the way I'd pushed so much away during the marriage itself. Elena, without my ever explaining why, seemed to understand instinctively on the mornings I showed up at her shop looking hollowed out, and would simply make tea and let me sit in the back room in silence for an hour before either of us said anything at all. I had, by spring, mostly stopped flinching at the sound of my own phone. I'd gotten a new number the week I arrived, given it to almost no one, Renee, Elena eventually, the woman who cleaned the villa twice a month. When it rang now, it was rarely anything urgent, which had become itself a small daily miracle I tried not to take for granted. One afternoon in May, I was walking back from the beach when I stopped in the middle of the alley leading to my door. A man was standing at the far end of it. He was skeletal, his cheekbones sharp against thin skin, his eyes sunk deep into his face. He was wearing a black overcoat, which looked almost comically wrong against the white walls and the bright Santorini sun. It was Nathaniel. I stood 10 feet away and looked at him for 3 seconds. Then I kept walking toward my door. As I passed him, he spoke. "Vivian." I didn't stop. "Vivian." His voice came again, rougher this time, scraped raw. "Please, stop." I stopped at my door, key in hand, my back to him. "How did you find me?" "It took a long time." His voice came from behind me. "Renee wouldn't tell me anything. I hired someone. It took 3 months." I unlocked the door and stepped inside. "Wait!" I didn't close the door, but I didn't turn around either. "Say what you came to say." I heard his footsteps, slow and unsteady, come to a stop at the threshold. He didn't come in. "I have stomach cancer," he said. "Terminal." My cat trotted over and wound himself around my ankles. I know. The doctors say 6 months, maybe, at most. Okay. A long silence stretched out between us. I wanted to see you. One last time. You've seen me, I said. I finally turned to face him. He was even thinner in person than he'd looked from across the alley. He held out a folded paper envelope, his hand shaking with the effort. This is the diagnosis, in case you think I'm lying about any of it. I looked at the envelope. I didn't take it. There's no need. Vivian, I looked at him. My voice, when I spoke, came out calm, entirely without warmth, the way you'd speak to a stranger who'd stopped you on the street. What do you want? I wanted to say I'm sorry. He faltered on the words. You've said it. His hand dropped. The envelope slipped from his fingers and hit the ground between us. He stood in the doorway, the sun behind him throwing a long, thin shadow across my floor. I know nothing I say fixes anything, he said, his voice barely holding together. But I want you to know I regret it. Every day. Every second since I found out about our child. Which child? I asked, crossing my arms. The one on your shoulders that night? Or the one who died inside my body while you were holding him? He staggered back a step, as if I'd physically struck him, and caught himself against the white wall of the alley. Did you know, I said, that he used to kick me every morning at 5, like clockwork? I told you about it once. You were looking at your phone. You said, and never looked up. His knees buckled under him. He tried to stay standing and couldn't, and he went down onto the stone path outside my door. I'm sorry, he choked out. Forgive me, or scream at me, or hit me, I don't care which. Just don't look at me like I'm already a dead man. I looked down at him, the man who'd once run a $5 billion company, kneeling on a stone path in Greece, holding a terminal diagnosis in his shaking hand. And I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, nothing at all. It's like looking at a fact, I said softly, not angry, not scornful, just stating something true, the way you'd note that the sky is blue or the sea is salt. You have cancer. It's a consequence. His hand fell to his side and tears began sliding silently down his gaunt, hollowed face. I looked at him one last time, then stepped inside and closed the door. The latch clicked softly into place. I sat down on the sofa and my cat jumped up into my lap. Outside, the sea was a brilliant, uncomplicated blue. After a long while, I heard his footsteps start again, slow and uneven, fading away down the alley until they were gone entirely. He was gone. I picked my book back up and kept reading exactly where I'd left off. 6 weeks later, Renee called again. Vivian, Nathaniel passed away 3 days ago. I was hanging laundry on the terrace, a white cotton shirt lifted in the sea breeze. How? Complications from the cancer. He was alone from what I heard. I see. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. The weather's beautiful here today. I hung up. I sat down in the lounge chair on my terrace, and my cat curled into my lap the way he always did in the late afternoon. The sun was warm on my skin. He was dead. It felt like a door I'd closed a long time ago had finally, quietly, been locked from the other side. A white sailboat drifted across the glittering water in the distance. I took a sip of the iced lemonade sitting on the little table beside me, cool faintly sweet, exactly as it should be. I was alive. I was in the sun, by the sea, and I had made it here on my own, and I intended to stay. I think about the baby sometimes, still. Not every day anymore, but often enough that I doubt it will ever fully stop. I think about the way he used to kick me every morning at 5, so reliable it felt like a promise. I never got to give him a name. For a long time, I thought that was a kind of failure on my part. One more thing I hadn't managed to do right. I've come to think of it differently now. Some things don't need a name to matter. Some absences are simply themselves, permanently, and you learn to carry them without needing to call them anything at all. I don't regret leaving the way I did, quickly, completely, without warning, without giving him the chance to talk me out of it. I don't regret the 6 programs, or the empty closet, or the SIM card I dropped into a trash can outside an airport on a cold October morning. I don't regret any of it. What I regret, if I'm honest, is smaller and older than any of that. I regret the years before that night. All the mornings I felt those small kicks alone in the dark and never woke him to share it. All the late nights I spent at a laptop, quietly saving a company from itself, and never once let myself say out loud, "Look what I can do. Look what I've built." I regret how small I let myself become inside my own marriage. How much of myself I filed away and never spent, waiting for a version of him that was never going to arrive. I don't wait for anything now. I water the mint. I feed the cat. I read on the terrace until the light goes gold and then gray. Some mornings, right around 5, I still wake up out of old habit, my hand moving instinctively toward my stomach before I'm even fully conscious. It's empty, every time. I've stopped expecting it not to be. People ask me sometimes, Elena has asked me this, gently, over the 2 years since, and a couple of the other women I've slowly let into my life here have asked some version of the same question, whether I regret any of it. Not the marriage, the response to it. The programs I built in secret for 4 years and then switched off in a single afternoon. The clothes I refused to take. The silence I let Renee build around me like a wall, thick enough that not even a dying man could find a way through it for 3 full months. Whether, in the end, I think I was too hard, too fast, too complete in the way I disappeared. I've thought about this question more than almost any other in the 2 years since, turning it over on quiet afternoons the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. And the honest answer? The one I finally arrived at somewhere around the first anniversary of that night is no. I don't regret it. I think there's a version of this story where I stayed, where I forgave the party, forgave the missed calls, forgave the years of small absences that came before them, and tried to build something new out of the wreckage of what was left. I think about that version sometimes, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of clinical curiosity, the way you might wonder about a road you drove past without turning onto. I don't think that version ends well for me. I think I know, with more certainty than I know almost anything else, that the woman who stayed would have kept shrinking, year over year, until there was nothing left of her worth saving at all. I like the woman who left considerably better. I think she deserved considerably more than she was getting, and I think it took losing everything in a single night to finally make that fact impossible to keep looking away from. I got a letter last spring, an actual letter, paper and ink, forwarded through 3 different addresses before it finally found me, from the head of legal who'd resigned that day at Callaway Holdings, the woman who'd handed Renee an envelope in the hallway, and asked her to pass along a message. She'd written to say she hoped I was well, that she'd started her own small firm since everything collapsed, and that she still thought, more often than she expected to, about the day she'd watched Renee Foss walk out of that office with a briefcase, and had understood, in that instant, that the ground under all of them had already shifted permanently. She didn't ask me for anything. She just wanted me to know she'd seen it, seen what had actually been happening underneath the surface for years before anyone said it out loud. I wrote back. It felt important to write back. I think about the baby's due date sometimes, which would have been early February. I let myself think about it fully on that particular day now, rather than pushing it into some locked room the way I did for most of that first difficult year. I sit on the terrace and I let the whole shape of it move through me. The mornings I never got to wake up to. The 5 a.m. kicks I never got to feel one final time before they would have naturally stopped. The name I never got to choose because I was too afraid, in the moment, that choosing one would make the loss even larger than it already was. It still hurts on that day, every year. I don't imagine it will ever entirely stop hurting, and I've made my peace with that too. Some things aren't supposed to heal all the way. Some things are just supposed to become bearable. And bearable, I've come to believe, is its own kind of victory. Quieter than the other kind, but no less real. But the sun still comes up over that water every single morning regardless, indifferent and constant in exactly the way I've come to find comforting, rather than cruel. Fairy still waits by my feet for his breakfast, unbothered by any of it, the way only a cat can be unbothered by the weight of a person's entire history. Elena still opens her shop at 9 and saves me the good coffee. The tourists still come through in the summer and leave in the fall, and the water stays exactly the same brilliant, uncomplicated blue through all of it, indifferent to who's watching. And I am here for it. I am here, and I am whole enough, and some mornings that feels like the largest accomplishment of my entire life. Larger than anything I ever built at a laptop at 3 a.m. to save a company that never once thought to ask who was saving it. I built myself back too, in the end. Slower, and with no algorithm to guide me through it, but I built it all the same. And it's mine, and no one is ever going to be able to take it from me again. Sometimes on the ferry back from the mainland, I catch myself watching some other woman traveling alone, a certain set to her shoulders, a certain careful way of holding a phone she's clearly hoping won't ring, and I recognize something of myself in her, without ever needing to ask her story. I don't approach these women, usually. I've learned that unsolicited recognition from a stranger, however well meant, can feel like one more demand on a person who's already carrying more than her fair share of them. But I think about them afterward, on the walk home from the dock, and I find myself hoping, quietly and specifically, that whatever brought her here finds its own version of a blue terrace and an orange cat and a bookshop 2 streets back from the water. I hope she finds her own Elena. I hope, whatever man or circumstance sent her looking, that she never goes back to being smaller than she actually is, ever again, for anyone. That, in the end, is the only real inheritance I took away from 4 years with Nathaniel Calloway and one unbearable night in a bathroom in a house I never wanted to think about again. Not the money. I never touched a cent of his, and I never will. Not even really the satisfaction of watching a company collapse under the weight of its own neglect, though I won't pretend that particular symmetry didn't mean something to me, somewhere quiet and honest, in the months it was happening. What I actually kept, what turned out to matter, was smaller and far more durable than either of those things. The flat, simple knowledge that I am allowed to leave. That my life belongs to me entirely the moment I decide it does. And that no house, no name, no ring, and no amount of quiet, patient loyalty owed to a version of love that stopped being reciprocated somewhere around year 2 is worth what it costs to stay somewhere you have already, quietly, stopped existing. I am Vivian Winters. I have been, again, for 2 years now. I water my mint every morning, and I feed my cat, and I read on my terrace until the light turns gold and then gray. And some mornings still, right around 5, I wake out of old habit with my hand already moving toward my stomach, reaching for a small, insistent kick that stopped coming a long time ago and is never coming back. I let my hand rest there anyway some mornings, just for a moment, before I get up and start the rest of the day. The way you might rest your hand briefly on a closed door before finally, gently, turning away from it and walking back out into whatever light